Colonialism and translation. As is mentioned earlier, translation is a notoriously political exercise and presupposes context of power. This was amply testified in the way colonial powers orientalized the people and culture of their colonies through varieties of textual practices. For example, when Edward Lane published his popular translation of The 1001 Nights in 1859, he went on to say in the introduction to the book that the Arabs were more gullible and did not distinguish between reality and fiction as educated Westerners would do. Such an aspect of the act of translation foregrounds the asymmetry and essential imbalance between the source language and the target language engendered by power. In this context, Tejaswini Niranjana rightly observes, by employing certain modes of representing the other, which it thereby also brings into being, translation reinforces hegemonic versions of the colonized, helping them acquire the status of what Edward Said calls representations or objects without history. Citing Translation 1992. Even someone as nationalistic as Tagore fell prey to this politics of representation in translation. Mahashweta Sengupta has pointed out how Tagore's translation of Bengali Gitanjali actualized Western fantasies of the East as a place where saints and prophets brought deliverance to ordinary people. By his translations, Tagore was adding another piece of the existing edifice of Orientalism, making himself a representative of the otherness that was very alluring to the Western tradition. Postcolonial theory and translation. As is well known, postcolonialism refers to a wide variety of social and political practices that militate against the Anglo-American academic discourses so as to participate in the way the third world societies are perceived, comprehended and represented. Many third world societies today utilize translation in the post-colonial scenario as a weapon to subvert the hierarchical relationship between the linguistic and cultural worlds represented by the source text and the target text. The colonized culture also engages in translation even as it gets translated. It seeks to resist and subvert the culture of the colonizer by a strategic reoccupation of spaces and discourses which are in the control of dominating culture. Postcolonial translation. Maria Timoko perceives translation as a metaphor for the post-colonial because the imperial politics of representation bestowed upon the Europe the status of the original, regulating the identities of its inferior colonies, which were obliged to be translated in tandem with Eurocentric discourse. The object of associating post-colonial with translation is to reclaim and rewrite the histories and literary traditions of the languages and people marginalized and dehistoricized by the Orientalist discourse. In India, the almost all regional languages have a rich and vibrant history of culture and civilization of more than 700 years now. But the Orientalist discourse focused absolute attention on Sanskrit language as well as Vedic Hindu religion and represented them as monolithic categories to constitute India's identities. Post-colonial translation in Indian context is all about creating knowledge about native culture and tradition right from the horse's mouth. However, such a project has its own set of problems. Empire writes back in English. Bill Ashcroft, Garrett Griffiths and Helen Tiffin have averred that in post-colonial era, the colonized other has reclaimed his or her cultural agency by rejecting the canons of literary and artistic production imposed by master narratives in favor of an alternative literary and cultural aesthetics. They further maintain that the post-colonial writing defines itself by seizing the language of the center and replacing it in discourse fully adapted to the colonized place, 1989. This dictum in particular sounds problematic because it insists on a kind of linguistic totalitarianism. English is inadequate to address socio-cultural realities of India. A rabid insistence on the empire to write back in English smacks of politics of domination and neo-colonialism. Today, unfortunately, Indian writing in English is the only category that gets projected when post-colonial writing from India is discussed, despite the fact that there is a lot of vibrant work being done in regional languages that is post-colonial in nature. Radical theories of post-colonial translation. In her scholarly book citing translation, History Post-Structuralism and the Colonial Context 1992, Tejaswini Niranjana maintains, in a post-colonial context, the problematic of translation becomes a significant site for raising questions of representation, power, and historicity. The context is one of contesting and contested stories attempting to account for, to recount the asymmetry and inequality of relations between peoples, races, languages. Niranjana's claim that the post-colonial theory and translation can reinvent oppositional cultures in non-essentializing ways is compatible with the post-structuralist call for the celebration of heterogeneity. Niranjana emphasizes that just as one can't aspire for accuracy in translation, a complete denial of historicity and referentiality is impossible. Thus, she presses the post-colonial translator to tune his translatorial effort to paradigmatic rather than syntagmatic level, to privilege literalness over meaning. Agency of post-colonial translator. Literary production in post-colonial India, be it IWE or ILET, has resorted to the subversive and self-assertive politics of abrogation and appropriation. Lakshmi Holmstrom. Abrogation is outright refusal of the notion of the correctness of usage, fixed meanings and assumptions dictated by the categories of imperial culture. Appropriation is the process by which English is adopted and adapted to express cultural experiences specific to India, that is, Indianization of English. When faced with references to specific aspects of the source culture, post-colonial translators or writers use a variety of tactics, including non-translation, as part of their overall strategy in order to reinvent their relations in a post-colonial context. Thus, Salman Rushdie startled the Western literati by profusely incorporating Hindi and Urdu words and phrases in the narrative of his works. Thus, translators in post-colonial era leave writer in peace and move the reader towards him. Militate against the norm of fluency that shaped the canon of foreign literatures in English. See foreignness and awkwardness of the translated text as the positive values in the evaluation of translation. Maria Timoko draws a wonderful analogy between the post-colonial writer and the translator and lays down their literary code of conduct. A minority culture or post-colonial writer will have to pick aspects of the home culture to convey and to emphasize. Similarly, a literary translator chooses an emphasis or privileges an aspect of the text to be transposed in translation. Timoko 2000. It would be significant to add to this and say that the choices, emphases and selectivity of the translator seeking to break the imperial gestalt should be governed particularly by ideological fervor before anything else. Even at the risk of offending the patrons, publishers and political ideologues, as Rushdie did, the post-colonial translator will have to foreignize their artifact